All communication is cultural, and every person is multicultural, meaning that we all represent different cultural standpoints in one being. Nevertheless, communication sits within a historical and contemporary context of power. Today, in intercultural communication barriers, or I should say, cultural communication barriers, we will continue to discuss the pejorative or the negative elements of cultural communication. Last time, we talked about ethnocentrism, stereotyping, prejudice, discrimination, xenophobia, and fear. And so today we'll extend that lecture and talk about rhetorical artifacts, some of the texts that we are inundated with on a daily level that influence our perception of this context. Remember, we're looking at reality like a symbolic or a linguistic structure. This structure influences our behavior, gives us the rules and the norms, and influences the way we perceive reality. Indeed, it brings a piece of reality into fruition, into manifestation. It becomes real. And so the symbol becomes intertwined and ingrained with material objects and bodies. And so if you want to look at the context of any given society, you might look back at the artifacts or the rhetorical texts. And so D.W. Griffith's racist film, The Birth of a Nation, is indicative of the power context of America at the time. The film is a racist abomination that influences and sparks a resurgence of hate groups that still has lasting effects to this day. At the same time, it was the most expensive film and the largest production ever made at the time. And so it is still oftentimes heralded as a technological achievement. This film does not just sit in the past, it influences the way we see the world today. And so if you want to understand the context of any given society, you can just look back at some of the acts of communication. Many of those acts of communication are rhetorical artifacts and are still with us today. And so this is what we do a little bit as rhetorical scholars and communication scholars. And so the context, fortunately, can be changed through other communication acts that take place in the future. And so the 2016 film Birth of a Nation, which is a true story about Nat Turner, who leads a slave revolt, comments on the previous film by taking the same title, remixing it, bouncing it, and making it now associated with a different story. And so you can see how we do not just passively use communication or even receive the communication structure or network. We are able to comment on this structure and even change it through our own acts of communication. Nevertheless, we should go back and unpack and learn from the artifacts and rhetorical texts that are still with us. I encourage people to go see both films, compare and contrast. And so we might talk about some of our popular artifacts that we have at our disposal today. And so Family Guy, Identity, and Context is where we left off last time when we were discussing ethnocentrism and stereotypes. Now, stereotypes are generalizations. They are essentializations that boil or reduce people down to some sort of essence. And we can see this everywhere. And they are not just innocent generalizations or essentializations. They tell us a story of the power context. And we might think about a power context at some grand level of governmental policy, or we might think about it at a small daily level of cultural norms and societal expectations that we encounter almost every day and almost every minute of every day. Indeed, these texts are all around us. Now, I enjoy Family Guy immensely. Every once in a while, I think I just need some Stewie in my life, and I turn on the show and see what Stewie is up to. And so it's a well crafted and oftentimes hilarious show. I still enjoy the show, but as a critical communication scholar looking at this text from a cultural perspective, I can now use it to unpack some essentializations, some stereotypes that even talk and tell me a little bit about the power context that I am situated within as a viewer of this show. And so, if we think about the identity of certain characters, a few characters come to mind that are portrayed in a stereotypical manner. Exhibiting an ethnocentrism that is telling of the context. And so Mort oftentimes enters the scene and is reduced to a tired Jewish stereotype. And makes a joke oftentimes about money, and you almost always know that it is coming. His characterization in terms of his speech, the content of his messages, and his appearance can be nothing short of stereotypical and quite damaging, and we'll see why. And so here comes Mort into the picture. Consuelo. Consuelo is oftentimes reduced to a single word, no, that is drawn out and becomes her tagline or her motto throughout the show. She is almost always a housekeeper and almost always wearing her housekeeper uniform. Clearly, she is being stereotyped as a Latinx identity. And so you can see how Consuelo, even if she's hanging out with the mayor or at a sporting event or at a party, never really breaks out of this identity construction. And that seems to be the problem here. Tricia Takanawa. Tricia is, of course, a news reporter. And once again, she is always a news reporter. Whatever she is covering on the job, she is a news reporter, but also in her daily life and every time she enters a scene. She even has to say, Asian reporter Tricia Takanawa almost every time. And so you can see how she is also stereotyped. Now, what is interesting is that she is kept in this stereotypical portrayal and not really allowed to flourish and become whoever she wants to become, right? And so this is the problem with stereotypes. They moor individuals down to a certain identity that they have no power over to control. Now, remember, this, of course, is a fictional portrayal, but it depicts real life. And then it also produces the way we respond to situations in real life. And so then there's Peter. Now, Peter is the star of the show. And of course, Peter, the difference with Peter is he is allowed to be whoever it is that he wishes to be. And so there is really no stereotyping Peter. There is no essentialization going on in Peter. And so this is the opposite of dehumanization. This is really humanizing, giving Peter the ability to be whoever he wants to be. And of course, he is smiling oftentimes and he is happy because of this. And so if you're ever interested in the power dynamics in any context, on any artifact, just watch the artifact, listen to the artifact, read the artifact, and see who is successful at the end, who is happy, who leads a long and positive life. And then on the opposite, look at the people who suffer. and the people who don't end up on the winning end of the narrative. And once again, this is fictional, but we can still see real suffering in this fictional narrative or portrayals. And isn't that what artifacts ask of their audience? To step into this imaginary scene and feel as the characters do. And so Peter's allowed to be whoever it is he wants to be. Um, Oftentimes, this relies on tired stereotypes of otherness. And so, Peter has a Native American stereotype here. And so, this is Native American identity funneled through white ethnocentrism here. Still, Peter is happy as he flourishes and frolics in the land of otherness. Peter as Rihanna. This is an actual depiction of a dress that Rihanna wore to an award show. And so here Peter is once again happy, assuming the bodily and cultural stance of Rihanna. Peter as an Arab stereotype. And so here, Peter once again steps into the shoes of someone else to give his character a little bit of excitement and cultural difference and really embracing this difference. And so you can also employ a little bit of an oppositional reading, as Bell Hooks suggests. Look and see what is not there. Where is Rihanna? Where is Native American culture? Where is Arab identity here? It's really nowhere to be seen except through Peter, who we often see a lot of. He becomes a ship captain. And so now he has credibility. And he has credibility because he can be whoever he wants to be. We don't see Consuelo, Mort, or Trisha Takanawa as a ship captain, right? Or any other credible identity. So he becomes a teacher. And so ethnocentrism and stereotypes skews our understanding of credibility. And so when people are stereotyped, even if it's positive, even if it happens to be true in a singular instance, it's still negative and it's still false because it's applied to an entire group. And so this affects our understanding of reality and of the content of one's character, to quote MLK. And so here's Peter as a millennial. And so he's not even more down to his age. And we saw he's not more down to his ethnicity. He's not more down to his gender. So here he is as a millennial. It is comical, but it is indicative here of his ability to transgress those cultural confines that dominant context place on many people. He can be a hero here, assuming the role of a popular hero, Deadpool. He can also be a villain here, assuming the role of the Joker. And so ethnocentrism, stereotypes, and uncertainty. Uncertainty is an anxiety over difference. The main point here is not that these portrayals are just stereotypes and they are entirely inaccurate and they have no place in our portrayal of various identities. The point here is that they hold people down into boxes and only certain people. And so that's the problem. And we don't see that with Peter. And so ethnocentrism leads to stereotypes, which can lead to things that are worse, like prejudice and then outright discrimination. But this is where it starts with these light-hearted portrayals. It's a cartoon, it's made for adults, and it is also humorous. And so this allows us, and this softens the signifiers and allows us to absorb them. but they have real world implications. And all we have to do is look outside our windows and see a society that reflects these power inequalities. And so, uncertainty. The fact that this is a cartoon, and the fact that this is humorous, and the fact that although young folks are not supposed to watch the show, oftentimes they often do. And so this is how we enter into cultural communication. This is how we experience difference, by understanding difference and putting people into boxes. But oftentimes we do this according to the power structure, which is the real negative part of cultural communication here. And so, uncertainty and anxiety over difference. How do I enter into the conversation? How do I understand somebody else? When have I ever come into contact or discussion with somebody of a very distinct, different culture? And so, this produces an anxiety, and then we start to enter into the scene via these stereotypes. And we often see that in younger folk, and then we see people hold on to these stereotype differences because they really don't know or take the time to do the research about how other people live and the experiences that people different than you have in society. And so, in many ways, these stereotypes and essentializations become very real for people because that's the only access they have. Now, oftentimes, it doesn't really matter if somebody has an inclusive intention, if they produce an exclusive text or an exclusionary text or state a statement that excludes people, even if they mean well, or even if they are part of the marginalized group, still the outcome can be a barrier to cultural communication. And so the voice of Cleveland has recently been called out. It was previously played by a white individual, and that was seen as problematic. And that person was removed and replaced with a black actor. And so the voice of Cleveland now, at least, is played by a black actor. And so this black actor gets representation. Cleveland is better represented as the ethnicity that he is depicted as. And we have more people of color working in Hollywood and giving people maybe a slightly more authentic and real voice. However, is Cleveland's character going to change much within the context? Will we see Cleveland be a teacher? Will we see him be a ship captain? Will we see him break out of the stereotypical portrayal that is peppered throughout the show? And so those are questions that we might ask. And so, just as there's anxiety and uncertainty, which is almost always an aspect of cultural communication, and it's an aspect of intrapersonal communication. We have anxiety about communicating with ourselves concerning our different identity constructions and cultural affinities. Who am I today? Am I the mother? Am I the student? Am I the good employee? Right? And so those identities, we can have an internal conflict that is really a cultural conflict at the same time. But I think what changing the voice here marks is our assumptions of similarity. And so, just as we have anxiety with otherness, and sometimes that leads us to box people that are different than us in our understanding of a stereotypical portrayal, we also have assumptions of similarity, that everybody's experiences are just like ours, although that is very different. We all come from our own standpoints, and it is difficult, if not impossible, to fully understand the perspectives and the experiences of others. And so Maybe one of the reasons the Cleveland show is not successful. And an outcome of switching the actor marks the assumptions of similarity. That we are not all the same and we are not all born with the same access to power. And so, nice small move by Family Guy, but we'll see if that changes the content of the messages that are contained in the show. And so, moving towards the end here, we move to cultural theory. We used to say things like minority or subcultures, and we really don't say these terms anymore as we teach cultural communication. We might note something like co-cultural theory. Now, co-culture seems like every culture is on the same playing field, and ideologically, conceptually, that's what we want, and that's how we want to approach any given cultural structure. Yet, co-cultural theory marks a hierarchy. And so, how do we coexist within a cultural context that is hierarchical? And so that's what co-culture suggests. And it notes that people that are have historically been marginalized in any way oftentimes suffer from a mutedness. And so their voices are unheard. And so their experiences are unheard and overlooked as the dominant power context, whatever that happens to be in any given situation, assumes a similarity in identity, influence, and access to power. And so we see that with Cleveland, that mutedness of the Black experience. And so inserting a Black actor there recuperates that loss very slightly, but still it is a small recuperation as we attempt to move forward and change our text to better reflect the world that we would like to see. Lastly, cultural empathy. Learning and conveying cultural knowledge. And so, how do we learn? Right? The point is that we learn from these artifacts. Also, you can pick any examples from mainstream or even more obscure rhetorical artifacts and texts from society. And so, I encourage you to do that next time we talk. I encourage you to break down some of the essentializations and stereotypes that you see in advertising, mainstream media, movies, TV, and film. um, and so, how do we learn? We learn from these stereotypes, but we should do the work to go further and talk to individuals and not assume that we are similar, and also not assume that we understand the difference that we might have a little uncertainty over, or a little anxiety over. And so when we are uncertain, when we are fearful of not knowing, we tend to fill in that space. And we fill in this space with little slivers of what we think we know and a self serving bias. They oftentimes, those fillings perpetuate inequalities that we have been enculturated to understand as true knowledge. And so, attempting to be empathetic, understanding from other people is what we are going for. Thank you.